Please join me in welcoming to Distinctive Voices, Robin Mason.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. And I'll give the first slide there. So I wonder, first of all, if anybody managed to catch the PBS broadcast of the Journey to Palomar. Okay, good. And then also, are any of you Southern California natives, or have you lived here most of your lives? And of those, have any of you visited the Palomar Observatory or the Mount Wilson Observatory? Oh, good for you. Okay, good. Well, we have a little bit of background then. I just like to find out all of who knows what and who's been where. If you have never been to the observatories, they're open from April through October for public tours. And I think Mount Wilson is free. Palomar is $5 or something like that. And I hope that after tonight you'll really want to make an effort to go and see the giant telescopes. It's quite an amazing experience. Perhaps many of you are like Todd and I before we started this project, which we were great astronomy enthusiasts, and we tried to follow all the latest discoveries, but without ever really understanding the history behind them and how this incredible technology and wonders like the Hubble Space Telescope became possible. So since we only have limited time tonight, I'm only going to play the last 30 minutes of the film, which is essentially the story of the Palomar 200-inch telescope. And so first, I'd like to just briefly fill you in on some of the essentials of the story of this forgotten hero, American hero George Ellery Hale, who led the Palomar project and essentially made modern astronomy possible. He also founded the National Research Council of the National Academy of Sciences, and I think that's pretty significant, especially for tonight. And then after the film, Dr. Ellis is going to take us into the next decade with the building of the 30-meter telescope, and you'll see that really this is all part of the continuous same story, and it's all connected and continues today. And hopefully at that point you'll have a brand new appreciation for what you'll be witnessing in the coming decades. So that's why we're here doing this together tonight. Now, I should also add that if you didn't see the film, you can easily watch the first half because you can rent it through Netflix or it's available from Amazon.com or PBS Home Video. So just mention that before we get started. Okay, the Palomar 200-inch telescope is officially known as the Hale telescope. And George Ellery Hale was the astronomer who was the prime mover behind the Palomar project. He was 60 years old at the start of the project. I think that's about the right age photograph right there, in 1928. And he had already built the 3 biggest telescopes in the world by the time he was 60 years old. And these things were done by individuals in his time. Now they're huge science consortiums, but in Hale's time, he had to raise the money. He had to hire the people. He had to lead the technological charge to build these telescopes. So it was all about individuals. So before World War II, in the 1960s, when astronauts actually started traveling into space, Hale's observatories were America's space program. And so I guess one of the things that we discovered as we were doing our research is that the achievements of space scientists throughout the 20th century were so spectacular, especially with NASA and the moon landing, that by the time we got to the end of the century, the achievements of the first half were being all but forgotten in the glare of the achievements of the second half. So that was an incredibly important thing to us, and we actually subtitled our DVD, America's First Journey into Space, because that's what we found that it was. So in these rare home movies of Hale in the 1930s, he's helping his grandson learn to carry the flag. That's kind of amazing footage that we found. Hale may have built the 3 biggest telescopes in the world, but he also famously had 3 nervous breakdowns doing it. At one very low point, he supposedly had a visual hallucination of a little man, a sort of demon or elf, that would appear out of nowhere and torment him. And as intriguing as that is, though, the story of Hale's life and his telescopes is just as fascinating. Hale inherited his fragile nerves and excruciating headaches from his mother, Mary Hale, but she had also given her son his insatiable curiosity and imagination. She read him the classics growing up, like Jules Verne's books like From the Earth to the Moon, which has uncanny parallels to the Palomar project. Hale inherited an overabundance of ambition and optimism from his father, William Hale, who was a real estate developer in early Chicago after the Great Fire had destroyed all of the downtown section of Chicago. And so William Hale and some now famous architects like Daniel Burnham completely rebuilt Chicago from the ground up after the fire, and he was one of the prime movers in that effort. His buildings, the famous Rookery Building and the Reliance Building in Chicago, were William Hale's buildings, among numerous others. And they allowed he actually, his business was hydraulic elevators, and so he allowed the skyscrapers to go up after the fire because he manufactured hydraulic elevators. So that's how he made his money. And then his son was able to go into science. So now, as for Hale's telescopes, when he was only 25, Hale's first giant telescope was the main attraction at one of the most spectacular events in American history, which was the Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago. The fair was a celebration of America's progress in the 400 years since Columbus had landed. You could also ride his father's elevators to the top floor of the manufacturer's building to view the telescope. The manufacturer's building was the building in the background there, which was bigger than St. Peter's Basilica. The telescope had been paid for by Chicago streetcar baron Charles Yerkes, who built the Chicago L trains, elevated trains. With the exception, this is Charles Yerkes here, and with the exception of Al Capone, Charles Yerkes may be Chicago's most notorious scoundrel, actually. He had ripped up the streets of Chicago to build the streetcars, and most people thought of Yerkes more like this. Hale had convinced Yerkes that paying for the telescope would redeem his reputation. He really wanted to he really wanted to be accepted by the elite of Chicago, and so Hale convinced him that putting on his name on the world's biggest telescope would achieve that. When it was finally completed, the Yerkes Observatory put American astronomy on the map. Surprisingly, some of the older astronomers at the time thought that this observatory wasn't even really necessary. The most prominent astronomer in the country, Simon Newcomb, had said famously in 1888, "We are probably nearing the limit of all we can know about astronomy." Astronomers in those days were mostly cataloging stars and, still working out the motions and positions of the planets, which they had been doing for about 300 years since Galileo. And they already had telescopes that could do that. But Hale and some of his colleagues had other plans. They were greatly influenced by Charles Darwin's explanations of how life evolved on Earth, and they sought to do nothing short of unraveling the truth about the universe. For example, what stars actually were, and not just where they were, and how they evolved over time, just as Darwin had talked about evolution on the Earth. Hale and his colleagues were interested in the evolution of the entire universe, that it was one long process that began in the stars and led finally ultimately to a world of human beings. So by the late 19th century, tools like the spectroscope and the camera had been developed, and they could use these to combine astronomy with physics and chemistry. So this was the new science of astrophysics, and then it was hyphenated astro-physics. So while the public thought that the 40-inch Yerkes telescope was cutting-edge technology, in fact, it was really designed for the visual observing of the old astronomy, of observing, and the motions and positions of the planets and celestial objects. So what was needed for time exposure photography required for astrophysics was a giant reflecting telescope. So before the Yerkes telescope was even completed, Hale and his father had already ordered a 60-inch glass blank for a giant reflecting telescope, which would be the next biggest telescope in the world. But so then once again, Hale needed the funds to mount the mirror into the telescope. In 1902, steel titan Andrew Carnegie, then considered the richest man in the world, had founded the Carnegie Institution of Washington to use his vast fortune from iron and steel production for the railroads to try to make American science the best in the world. Hale, at age 33, was the youngest member of its newly formed astronomy committee. It took him nearly 3 years to convince Carnegie to make a special grant for a brand new observatory devoted primarily to astrophysics. So Mount Wilson above Pasadena was deemed the best place on the planet for astrophysics. And in 1904, the Carnegie Institution trustees finally gave Hale the green light to found the Mount Wilson Solar Observatory. Solar because Hale's idea was to start by studying the spectrum of the sun and then apply the knowledge gained and the same techniques to understanding all stars. He built 3 new solar telescopes at Mount Wilson, and also the next 2 biggest reflecting telescopes in the world, which were the 60-inch telescope and the 100-inch telescope, which could see the 100-inch telescope could see the equivalent of a candle at 9,600 miles, and that's about 3 times the distance from LA to New York. So to build these enormous instruments 100 years ago on a rugged mountaintop, they had to haul hundreds of tons of equipment to the top of the mountain using mules. If you can imagine that. Just take a look at all of the iron and the mirrors and the equipment in those telescopes. You can imagine hauling that on mules. And it was about 8 or 9 miles up a dirt trail to get all of this stuff to the top of the mountain. It was later widened into a wagon road. So it was the equivalent of going once a day from the bottom to the top of the Grand Canyon. So by the time of the 100-inch telescope, they were using crude trucks. And here they're taking a large part of the 100-inch tube up the mountain. And there were mishaps. It was rough going. They finally succeeded. This is the mirror for the 100-inch telescope. In the 4 attempts to pour the glass for it, men had been badly burned and even lost limbs. So after the glass disc arrived all the way from France and they uncrated it, this is what they saw. The glass was so full of bubbles and strains, and there you can see them. This is a present-day photograph taken through the side of the mirror glass. It was so full of bubbles and strains that Hale's own optician, George Ritchie, declared that the disc was unusable. John D. Hooker, the LA hardware king who had put up the money for it, then refused to pay for the disc. And next, he accused Hale of flirting with his wife. And Hale probably was. But that was when Hale had his first nervous breakdown, and his troubling hallucinations started to appear. Here you can see from the side of the disc some of the other problems with the disc. It was they had to pour it in 3 layers, which is what you see there, because they didn't have a mold that was large enough to do it in 1 layer. So after several unsuccessful attempts to pour a new disc, the experts decided to go ahead and polish the original, that there weren't so many bubbles near the surface that it would cause problems with the polishing. As you can see, there's plenty of solid glass there near the surface. And it did, in fact, hold together. So when the 100-inch telescope finally went into operation in 1918, newsreels proclaimed Mount Wilson the scientific eye of America. So also during this time, I guess while they were waiting for the 100-inch telescope to go into operation, in his spare time, Hale founded Caltech, and he founded also the National Research Council during World War I, and was back in Washington for several years, organizing all of the science and engineering departments of American universities toward the war effort. And so that was still in place in World War II, and also is still in place today, advising the government on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So that's a pretty big accomplishment, I'd have to say. So Mount Wilson astronomers were well on their way to cracking the secrets of stellar evolution. They had discovered that the sun was not at the center of the known universe of the Milky Way galaxy, but nearer the edge. They had determined the diameters of stars, some that were 200 or 300 times as big as our sun. Astronomer Edwin Hubble and others had found evidence that the strange fuzzy objects like the Andromeda Nebula that had long been observed might actually be other galaxies at vast distances from our own. In those days, they called them island universes. By the end of the 1920s, Hubble would also discover hard evidence that the universe was not static, but was actually expanding. It was becoming clear that even the 100-inch telescope soon would not be big enough. So after his third nervous breakdown, Hale had been forced to give up the directorship at Mount Wilson, and he began to devote time to his family and his own research on the sun at his private solar observatory that he built for himself in Pasadena. And this is adjacent to Caltech in the residential area off of California Boulevard, if any of you are familiar with that area. It's privately owned today, but there are often events and things there, so you might have an opportunity to visit. And the solar telescope at this facility is as effective as the solar telescope on Mount Wilson. It's just a different configuration. It's a kind of a folded configuration. So what Hale didn't realize, though, was that his biggest project was just about to begin. The Rockefeller Foundation had followed the progress at Mount Wilson, and in 1928 offered $6 million for a giant new telescope, if Hale would head the project. How could he resist the largest grant in the history of science to build a new giant telescope? His irrepressible optimism carried him forward once again. He would have the best designers, the help of the leaders of American industry, and also his talented staff at Mount Wilson. So how difficult could it possibly be? So now we'll show you how difficult it was, and if we could just go ahead and roll the film, we'll take it from there.
In March of 1934, 2.5 years after accepting the job, Macaulay geared up to pour the glass giant. It would take nearly a month to melt 65 tons of the new Pyrex mixture. Electricians and masons were busily perfecting the heating elements in the ingenious waffle-like mold, which was designed to reduce the overall weight of the finished glass from 40 to 20 tons. But what would happen to the 17 feet of high-temperature Pyrex as it cooled? Would the new formula hold together, or would it crack and render the whole telescope useless? Nobody knew for sure. The Super Pyrex had a melting temperature close to 3,000 degrees, well above the temperature of lava. Corning suddenly faced another battle, this time on the publicity front.
If you talk to people from that era, you find out that when they were kids, they all knew about the building of this great telescope, the great 200-inch telescope. There were constant newspaper stories about what was happening, what was going on.
The exact day of the pouring was too big to keep secret. A local reporter had picked it up, and NBC was soon broadcasting it nationwide.
Hello, everybody. This is Lowell Thomas speaking, flashing to you the news of the world.
When Lowell Thomas finished giving his broadcast, he said, without qualification, it was the single most significant event of the 20th century, a list from which he did not exclude the First World War.
The next morning, the Corning switchboard went crazy. Everyone wanted to see the giant mirror being made. Corning executives suddenly found themselves inviting a great number of dignitaries from science and industry. George Hale, who longed to see the operation, waited to hear the reports from Macaulay. Lowell Thomas would be there. The newsreel cameras would be there. 10,000 people had applied for permits to witness the event. Visitors couldn't find rooms. For Macaulay and the Corning Company, this wasn't just a big pouring job. This was now a performance on the world stage.
The workmen who handled the ladles, of course, were shielded and protected with portable shields from the intense heat. And of course, as they would open the door on the furnace in order to reach the ladle into the glass and to dip the glass, so that was also hot, even hotter than when they were pouring into the mold.
Each ladle contained 750 pounds of glass. There were special workers who would spray the outside of the ladles with water so that the ladles themselves wouldn't melt. 300 pounds of the glass would stick to the inside of the ladles and have to be reheated. It was a back-breaking procedure. It would take 100 ladles and over 10 hours to fill the mold.
And the beginning of the pour went spectacularly. The public loved it. Everything was going swimmingly. They had a lunch break because you couldn't expect this crew to work straight through. At the end of lunch break, George Macaulay had a phone call from England, which was a fairly rare thing in 1934. He answered the call. He answered all of the questions, then came back onto the floor where the pouring was going on and saw from the colors of the faces and expressions that something had gone wrong. Nobody had said what it was, but he went forward, looked into the mold, and saw that one of the forms had broken loose and bobbed to the top of the disc. By the time the pour was finished, 22 of the forms had bobbed to the top.
The disc was ruined. Macaulay felt that they had no choice but to try again. Corning's reputation was on the line. They repeated the difficult procedure. The biggest advantage in the second pouring was that there were no public spectators. At the end of the long day, the giant mold with molten glass was rolled on rails to a specially built annealing oven, where it was allowed to slowly cool a few degrees per day. Any faster, and it would crack. It would take a full year before they knew if it had worked. Day after day, the temperature was checked. Half a year went by when a new problem arose.
The Corning factory had on occasion experienced floods in the lower level. Macaulay, cautious man that he was, very carefully built all of his equipment well above the high water mark that had ever been reached in any flood at Corning. But that spring it rained and rained, and when it did, the waters began to flood the lower level of the factory space.
The lower level held the transformers, keeping the glass warm. The Corning Fire Department was urgently called in to pump water out.
During this whole process, the power had to be turned off.
For 3 days, the glass cooled uncontrollably.
Well, annealing glass, at least a piece of glass that large, was itself a black art. Repairing a ruined annealing schedule was a black art on top of a black art.
Hale had no choice but to do what he enjoyed the least: waiting. 5 months went by. In October of 1935, Macaulay decided it was time. He opened the lid and saw that the biggest piece of glass in the world was in one piece.
Thank you. So I hope you have a little new appreciation for the beautiful images that you've seen over the years. So here to talk about tonight the continuing adventure of astronomy with me is Dr. Richard Ellis, who was head of the Caltech Optical Observatories and is helping lead the new adventure of the 30-meter telescope. So on our home video version of the Journey to Palomar, we have 3 DVD extras about the next generation of giant telescopes, one of which is the 30-meter telescope. So this is 6 minutes long, and we thought we would just play that for you real quick to give you an introduction, and then Dr. Ellis is going to continue and tell you a little bit more about that, and then we'll do a Q&A.
Imagine yourself now in 2016 being invited to the opening ceremony for the 30-meter telescope, and let's imagine that you've been to see the 200-inch telescope. Well, the first thing that will hit you is, of course, it is a larger dome, but not that much larger. What is greatly different is that the telescope occupies a much bigger fraction of the dome, and the mirror is enormous, and it will hit you in the face because it's such a huge mirror. The mirror is 100 feet in diameter. The overarching theme for the 30-meter telescope is the history of the universe. It sounds simple, but really we're looking at understanding the origin of the universe, how galaxies like the Milky Way formed for the first time and assembled, how more complex molecules developed in space that leads to life forms. So it's a very grand but incredibly fundamental quest. The 30-meter telescope is a reflecting optical near-infrared telescope which has a reflecting primary mirror that's segmented with 492 individual segments that combine to make a 30-meter aperture primary mirror. The light is reflected from the sky to a 3.5-meter secondary mirror and down to a third mirror, which we call a tertiary mirror, which rather uniquely can rotate to reflect the light to any one of a number of instruments. On the 200-inch, we're talking about instruments of maximum weight, 1 to 3 tons, and here we're now talking about instruments that potentially 20 to 30 tons or so. The departure to a segmented mirror telescope was inevitable when we got up to the 8 to 10 meter class level. We would never be able to make a 20 or 30 meter single piece of glass. It would be extraordinarily difficult to support, and we wouldn't maintain the curvature over a very large area, and it would be impossible to transport. Probably the most challenging aspect of the 30 meter telescope is the correction for the blurring in the Earth's atmosphere. This is a technique we call adaptive optics. It's already in regular use on our existing telescopes, such as the Keck and Palomar telescope. And the way it works is we take the light from a reference image, either a star or a laser reflected off layers in the Earth's atmosphere, and use this signal to monitor the turbulence in the Earth's atmosphere. Now, the Earth's atmosphere doesn't behave in a very cooperative way. It's certainly possible to make this correction along one line of sight, but if you want to correct a cone of light coming through the atmosphere, then you need a number of lasers, each shining off different parts of the atmosphere to create a correcting signal that can be applied to recover the true resolution of an object as if the telescope was in space. Astronomers are really fortunate because, of course, the telescope is used as a time machine. And so when we look deep in space, we're actually looking directly at history. And so the whole point of studying these early objects, the very faint distant galaxies, is to piece directly the story of how these galaxies change and grow to form the systems that we see today. The tapestry of evolution from those early times to the more familiar spiral galaxies and elliptical galaxies requires that we examine distant objects seen as they were in the past internally. That is to say, we would like to know whether they're rotating, whether they're merging with neighboring objects. And to do that, Hubble Space Telescope has shown us the images, but the 30-meter telescope will for the first time allow us to unravel how early galaxies assemble and transform into the grand systems with spiral arms, with smooth elliptical profiles that we see around us today. A galaxy like our own Milky Way has a central nucleus, and of course it has spiral arms. The Sun is in one of the spiral arms. And it has a large diffuse halo of stars, which we think are really quite old. But where do these components come from? And can we witness their direct formation by studying the internal details of more distant galaxies, seen as they were in the past? Turning closer to home, one of the other big science areas of great excitement now is finding planets around nearby stars. Of course, you have to realize a planet is only shining by reflected light, so it's very faint. What we're really interested in knowing is how did these planets form? Can we find any Earth-like planets? And crucially, can we find atmospheric evidence of the elements that would be conducive to forming life? These are not wild ideas. This is something that we really believe that the 30-meter telescope will be able to address. The most exciting discoveries, of course, are always the ones that are completely unforeseen, like the accelerating universe or the first planets around other stars, the most distant galaxies, or any surprise, gamma ray bursts, anything that was unforeseen that leads to new physics, a new understanding of the universe. Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Not very well. How about that? No? There we go. How about that? Yes, okay. Well, since I'm the first person standing up after Robin has finished, I'd just like to say that I witnessed the whole development of this remarkable documentary over a period of about, I think it's actually 7 years. I moved to California in 1999, and I met the Masons in 2001. And if there was a little glimpse of me there in the documentary, and you may have noticed that my hair is a lot more silver now, and that's not because I was worn out by the process. It's just that that's how long it's taken to produce this fantastic journey to Palomar. So I think we should congratulate Robin and Todd, who isn't here again. It's amazing. So you saw a glimpse of me a few years later talking about the 30-meter telescope, and I just, this won't take more than 5 minutes, hopefully. I'd like to tell you where we are on this project, which also involves the University of California. This is a somewhat out-of-date slide, but it just illustrates the scope of what we're attempting. And I think you'd agree that Hale, if he were alive today, would regard this as simply a continuation of the quest of his life. This is the 200-inch telescope here on the left, the Hale, now called the Hale telescope, and this is an early design for the 30-meter telescope. Hale, there are two quotes that I like to bring to your attention from George Ellery Hale, which I think are particularly motivating us even today in realizing the 30-meter telescope. One is this very famous one that starlight is falling on every square mile of the Earth's surface, and the best we can do is to gather it up and concentrate the rays that strike an area 100 inches in diameter. This was his mantra when he was planning the 200-inch telescope. And what this tells us is that a large aperture makes the telescope much more powerful. And so really the challenge is to build a mirror that's as large as we can afford in order to reach to the depths of the universe and study objects in as great detail as possible. But there's another, and I think far more insightful remark that he made even earlier, about 100 years ago. And he was pondering what would be the largest telescope that would ever be manufactured. And he didn't think engineering was ever going to be the limit. But he concluded that atmospheric disturbances, that is correcting for the blurring in the Earth's atmosphere, would probably be the limiting factor. And he speculated, correctly, but 100 years ago, that perhaps by some process now unknown, or then unknown, maybe we can correct for the blurring in the Earth's atmosphere. And if so, the astronomer will secure results far surpassing his present expectations. And that is the realization that you saw in that little clip of adaptive optics, the correcting for blurring in the Earth's atmosphere. So there are two major steps forward since Hale's time in making big telescopes. One is that we don't make monolithic mirrors like we saw in that Corning casting. We don't create uniform pieces of glass on the scale that is required for a 30-meter telescope. And the breakthrough here was the telescope intermediate between the 30-meter telescope and the Hale telescope, which are the two Keck telescopes in Hawaii. And the pioneer here is Jerry Nelson from the University of California, who was the project scientist for the Keck telescopes and is now also the project scientist for the 30-meter telescope. And the breakthrough was that we were able to manufacture and accurately phase 36 1.8 meter segments so that they make the surface of a single 10-meter aperture telescope. Cast your eye forward now to the 30-meter telescope, which is made of a 492 1.4-meter segments. These segments, trial segments, are now being manufactured by the 30-meter telescope project. And what we will imagine is a remarkably large mirror made of these segments, all very carefully and actively controlled to maintain the accurate surface of a 30-meter telescope. So in some sense, you could imagine the Keck telescope as a trial run of a very successful pair of telescopes that's been in operation now for about 12 to 15 years. And the second breakthrough is the correcting for the blurring in the Earth's atmosphere. We now shine lasers into the sky to create artificial stars, and we use the light from those artificial stars to monitor the turbulence in the Earth's atmosphere. And the signals we receive allow us to correct for the blurring in the Earth's atmosphere and get remarkably sharp images. For example, we can monitor the weather on more distant planets in the solar system. We can identify binary objects at the edge of the solar system. We can study the black hole in the center of the Milky Way, and much more. So we can even look at individual galaxies and see their internal properties so that we can study whether they're rotating and determine their evolutionary form. So we've seen a glimpse of what adaptive optics can do, and that's been very important in realizing and planning the 30-meter telescope. So what will the 30-meter telescope do? You saw a glimpse of that in that 6-minute video. One of the key questions is how the early galaxies that we see at great distances, and hence we see them at very early times, how they evolve into their present forms. We'd like to understand exactly the sequence of history that led us to the Milky Way that we live in today. We'd like to find the very earliest objects. We'd like to see objects that are forming for the very first time. We think the universe was originally quite dark, and then the very first stars switched on maybe when the universe was only a few 100 million years old. We would like to witness this event directly. It's probably one of the most important eras in early history. We have, of course, theorists who are always able to tell us what they expect to see, but the excitement, of course, is to directly witness it and learn about the universe when it's only 5% of its present age. And then, of course, we'd like to witness the abundance of planets. There are now over 300 planets that have been detected around other stars, but really their characteristics are not very well understood. We don't know how they form. We don't have a census of how many stars have planets of the size of the Earth. We're really only capable of studying massive planets. And so we'd like to try to understand exactly how abundant planets are and what's the sequence by which they form and what range of masses and how common are Earth-like planets. This is particularly important because we're launching satellites. As many of you probably know, we've just launched the Kepler satellite, which will detect planets by their transiting signal. When a planet goes in front of a star, it makes a very small adjustment in the light that we receive from that star. We're talking about only a millionth in change in signal. But Kepler will survey 100,000 stars and detect these very small fluctuations so that we can then turn the 30-meter telescope to detect and study the atmospheres of those stars and determine their chemical compositions. So where are we going to put the 30-meter telescope? I'd just like to conclude by telling you where we are. We've been, over the last four years, we've been doing a detailed design study. We have an office based in Pasadena, and we've been doing site testing both in South America, in the Atacama Desert. So here's the city of Antofagasta in northern Chile. We've been looking at 3 mountains in Chile. We've selected in Chile, we've selected this site, Cerro Amazonas, as you can see down here. Not a lot there. All right. Okay. Hopefully there'll be a 30-meter telescope there, not too far away. And then in the northern hemisphere, we've also realized the wonderful transparency of the Mauna Kea Observatory, where the 2 twin Keck telescopes are. Now, Mauna Kea is already a very crowded area, and of course it's It's our hope to compare these two sites, both politically and financially, and make a decision in July of this year. Many of you may know that getting a permit to build a telescope on Mauna Kea is more troublesome now than it was in the past. We're taking active steps to address the concerns of many of the residents in Hawaii that our telescope is a valuable addition to the state. But if that doesn't work out, then of course we have also the Amazonas site. So we have two sites. So this is my last slide. TMT is not, as Susan mentioned, led by Caltech. It is an equal collaboration between Caltech, the University of California, Canada, the country of Canada, and Japan. We have raised $80 million for the design study. That is nearly finished now. And the total cost of the telescope is a frightening $1 billion. And it would cost about $40 million a year to run. Now, that might be somewhat formidable to raise $1 billion, but we were very fortunate 18 months ago to receive, once again, you heard in the Journey to Palomar, the $6 million gift from the Rockefeller Foundation was the largest gift, certainly to science and certainly to astronomy in history up to that point. The Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation gave Caltech and UC the largest gift ever to astronomy, a $300 million leadership gift. So we have private resources already that is a significant fraction of the total cost of the capital cost of the project. Of course, we're hoping that our partners will mirror this, and we're seeking also federal funds through the National Science Foundation so that this can be regarded truly as a U.S. national telescope, as well as a telescope that Californian astronomers can use. And this is a departure. The Hale telescope, the 200-inch, was a privately funded telescope exploited only in the early years by astronomers at Caltech. Those days are over. We're now talking about a matching of private and public funds so that we have a partnership with the federal community as well as the private community. So we have this painful site decision to make. We can't probably raise any more money until we decide where to place the observatory. Assuming that our partners come forward with funds at the rate that we expect, then we would build construction in 2010 or 11. This will depend on whether it's on Mauna Kea or Amazonas, and the first flight would be in 2018. I will just be young enough in 2018 to go and observe with it, hopefully. So, thanks very much.
So I'd like to thank Dr. Ellis for that, and I would have to add that given the numbers that the government is throwing at bailouts these days, I would think they could pass a little on to the National Science Foundation. So we'll take a couple of questions, and then we'll go on to the reception. We can talk with you more there. If anybody has a question for either me or Dr. Ellis.
Is it possible, I mean, it's really crowded out there, but is it ever going to be, I guess it's physically possible to catch up with the farthest light of the...
Oh, yes. Yes. So so the question was, is there a danger that we will be able to look, as we look back in time or as we look at distance, that, we reach the edge of the universe and we don't see objects beyond a certain distance because they're receding from us faster than the speed of light? And the answer is no. We already are looking back 95% of the way back to the beginning with our current telescopes. What we see at the moment are just dots of light. What we would like to do is study those objects in more detail, measure their masses and sizes. As we look further back, a little bit further back, really the limiting factor is not the motion of the objects away from us, but simply the light gathering power and the ability to focus and get recognize very, very small objects. So objects, fortunately, can be seen to the beginning of when they switch on for the first time. So the question is, how is the size of the telescope chosen. There's two advantages as you go from the Hale telescope, which is a 5-meter. Is it okay to speak in metric units? Is that right? Very good. The U.S. officially went metric in 1948, in case you know. Okay, so the Hale telescope's 5 meters. Going up to 30 meters, two things happen. Firstly, you have a telescope that's 36 times more powerful in collecting light. Think of the mirror as a bucket collecting photons, light particles that are just coming from the sky. But much more importantly, as you make the mirror larger, its resolution, that is, it's the acuity of vision, its ability to see small objects, increases dramatically. And so, as I mentioned in the answer to the first question, the most distant objects are very, very small. And so our ability to resolve them and study detail in them increases significantly as we go to bigger telescopes. 30 meters was chosen as the practical diameter limit where we could apply this adaptive optics correction. Wouldn't you believe it? The Europeans are planning a 42-meter telescope. We're confident that they're going to de-scope when they realize how complicated it is to make the adaptive optics over that aperture.
How do they make the segmented glass
Right.
operate this one?
Yes. How does a segmented mirror behave as a single mirror? And the answer is that the segments are hexagonal, so they abut very closely. The gaps between the segments are only about 0.1 of an inch. And on the edge of each segment is a sensor that determines the relative position of that segment very, very precisely with respect to its adjacent segment on all of the hexagonal edges. These give signals to actuators underneath each segment, which allows each segment to both move up in a piston movement or tilt. And then when we point at the sky, we can collect the light from each and analyze the light from each segment on a bright star so that we can focus each segment independently. And this technique was pioneered by Jerry Nelson for the 10-meter Keck telescope. The main difference between the 30-meter telescope and the Keck telescope is that we've improved the technique. The actuators are faster. Computers are much faster now than they were in the 1980s when the Keck telescope was planned. And the sensors are much more reliable than the sensors that we used with the Keck telescope. It can maintain, in the case of the TMT, it'll be a departure from a parabola. It'll be more like a hyperbola. This is an optical surface that gives us a slightly bigger field of view. Are there any questions about George Ellery Hale? So the Hubble, the question is, the questioner is confused why we went into space, launched the Hubble Space Telescope, which I'll just drop is $4 billion, compared to the 30-meter telescope, which is now on the ground. Why are we coming back to the ground? The Hubble Space Telescope is only a 2.4 meter diameter mirror. It's actually smaller than the Hale telescope. Okay. The reason it's been so successful is, of course, it's above the Earth's atmosphere, not affected by weather, all right, and, of course, gives us very sharp views because it's unaffected by the blurring in the Earth's atmosphere. But the Hubble Space Telescope was planned in the 70s, was due to be launched in 1985. I remember it well when there was the Challenger accident. Then, of course, it was launched in 1990. Then there was a problem with the curvature of the mirror, and there was a rescue mission in 1993. During that period of time, and I'm not saying that the Hubble Space Telescope hasn't been a phenomenal success. I use it myself. I apply regularly for observing time on it. But now that we have the capability to correct for the blurring in the Earth's atmosphere and have a bigger mirror, then, of course, we have the combination of light-gathering power. Hubble cannot look and study the internal properties of distant objects because the mirror simply isn't powerful enough. So by coming back to the ground and investing in adaptive optics, it's cheaper, we get bigger mirrors, we still have the resolution. We will have actually 16 times better resolution than the Hubble Space Telescope.